What we're going to do is we're going to graph cubic equations. So the 5 cubics that I'm going to use are -8 and -1, 0, 1, and 8. Cube root of -8 is -2. Cube root of -1 is -1. Cube root of 0 is 0. Cube root of 1 is 1. And the cube root of 8 is 2. So our parent equation is going to look something like this, where we go -8 down 2, -1, -1, 0, 0, 1, 1, and 8, 2. And what we kind of see is it looks like an extended S. Now, domain and range is really easy here because it's all real numbers, or -infinity to infinity, for the domain and for the range. Now, when we're graphing these, I'm just going to use the middle 3, and we're just going to make sure that it uses the same form. So when we're looking at our 3 main ones, then we just know that we're extending those out, and that's what a cube root function looks like. So for our first one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the numbers -1, 0, and 1. When I plug in a -1, I find the cube root of it, which is -1, plus 2 is 1. When I plug in a 0, cube root of 0 is 0, plus 2 is 2. And when I plug in a 1, the cube root of 1 is 1, plus 2 is 3. So when I graph this, I have -1, 1, I have 0, 2, and I have 1 and 3. And then I'm going to extend it out. And for my domain, what I have is -infinity to infinity. And then for my range, I have the same, -infinity to infinity. And that's what my graph is going to look like. Now, my HK value, opposite inside, number outside, is always the center of the graph. And we'll kind of see a pattern develop, and then I'll talk about that. But just to take as a remembering, it's not like the square roots where it's the first one, it's the middle one. So for letter B, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to find our values. Now, the numbers that I want are -1, 0, 1. Notice that I'm going to the right one. So instead of -1, I have 0. Instead of 0, I have 1. Instead of 1, I have 2, because 2 minus 1 is 1. Cube root is 1, minus 2 is -1. When I plug in a 1, 1 minus 1 is 0. Cube root of 0 is 0, minus 2 is -2. And we could kind of see a pattern develop if we're looking closely at this. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to graph it. And I have 0, -3. I have 1, -2. I have 2, -1. And it's just an elongated S. Our domain, -infinity to infinity. And our range is going to be -infinity to infinity. So looking at the next one, it's a little bit more complicated. We're going to come up with our table of values. And once again, what I want is -1, 0, and 1. Just to pause for the last one, notice that the center is 1, -2. It's always the opposite inside and the number outside. So even with this one, the opposite inside would be 2. The number outside is 0. So that kind of gives us an idea of what our values are going to be. And what gives us a -1 is a 3. And what gives us a 1 is a 1. When I plug in a 1, 2 minus 1 is 1. Cube root of 1 is 1 times 3 is 3. And if we look at the pattern, what we notice is that it's going by threes. And the reason that it's going by threes is because the number in the front. And so once again, if we're looking at the pattern, there is a pattern that develops in each one of these. And if we look closely, what we notice is that the x values change by 1. And we're noticing that our y values are changing, the first one by 1, the second one by 1, but the third one, it's going by threes. So it's our a value in the front. We have 3, -3. We have 2, 0, and we have 1 and 3. Now, if you're looking, our s value is going the opposite direction, and the reason why is because we've got a negative in front of the x. So it means it's whatever the x value is, it's always the opposite. So it's going in the opposite direction. Now, looking at letter D, once again, I want to come up with my values. We know that our center point is always the opposite, so -3, and then our number on the outside is 0. I see that my a value is negative, so that means it's going down, so that helps me with the y values. Remember, we talked about the numbers being 1 apart, so -4 and -2. So there is a quick way of doing our table in order to make sure that our graph is done correctly, but also efficiently. So we're not spending a lot of time trying to figure out what our different numbers are. What we could do is we could figure out the pattern, and that helps us out a lot. So we have -4 and 1. I have -3 and 0. And I have -2 and -1. And we notice that's going the opposite direction again. This time the x isn't negative, but our outside is negative. So that means the y values are changing. So the y values also flip the graph. Our domain is -infinity to infinity, and our range is also the same, -infinity to infinity. Hopefully you notice that it's always going to be the same for each one of these, because each one goes to the left and right, and each one goes up and it goes down. So it goes in all directions. For our next one, what we're going to do is our table of values. Once again, what we want to do is figure out our center one, opposite, which is 2, and the number outside, which is 2. We see that it's going by 2's, so that means it's going to be 4 for the next one and 0 for the previous. And then our x values go by 1, so that would be 1 and 3. So once again, easy way to make the table. If that's a little confusing, we could always use the numbers -1, 0, 1 to help us out. So we have 1, 0, we have 2, 2, and we have 3 and 4. And so when we're looking at this, we have our graph. And just like every other one, our domain is -infinity to infinity, and our range is -infinity to infinity. For our last one, this one's a little bit more difficult, because if we're looking at our x values, 1, we see that they're negative, but 2, we see that it's a b value. And that's going to change what it's going to look like. What gives us 0 in the middle is still a 2, and we have the 1 on the outside. There's a 1 in the front, so this would be 2 and 3. The only thing is, with our x values, we have to figure out what gives us a -1. Now, if ever we get stuck, you could always take the inside and then just set it equal to whatever value that you want, and that makes it easy to solve for. So when we subtract the 4, we get -5. When we divide by -2, we get -2.5. So this is -2.5, and then what we have is positive 1.5. Negative make a positive, so then we have 1.5. Now what we're going to do is we're going to graph this, and once again, our b value was the reason why it's going by a half. Whatever that value is, we divide it by that value. And so what we have is 2.5 and 3. Then we have 2 and 1. And then what we have is 1.5 and 2. Ooh. Let's see. What did I... that should be a 0. Okay, so we have 2.5 and 0. That makes more sense. So when I was going by ones, then I should have gone in the reverse. And then we have 1.5 and 2. And that gives us our value. So domain, negative infinity to infinity. And then the range, what we have is negative infinity to infinity.